So there's a lot of road trip illustrations in this book of Numbers because it's about a journey. And so I need you to imagine, if you would with me, that you're on a family road trip, okay? You got everyone loaded in the minivan and you're cruising down the road. And so you can imagine this scenario. And about 30 minutes into your trip, one of the kids says from the back, "Hey, Mom. Hey, Dad. I need to go to the bathroom." Okay, and now in this scenario, you probably would say something like that, "Why didn't you go before we left the house?" And then the response in this particular scenario might be, "Because you didn't remind me." Now, in this hypothetical scenario that is not real life to me at all, in this scenario, your response might be something like a not so kind, calm displeasure at the blame shifting for this particular moment, okay? Now, anyway, your imaginary journey continues. And as you're heading off on the road trip about an hour or two later, you start to hear this from the back. "How much longer? I'm so bored. I'm hungry. It's hot back here. It's cold back here. I want out of the car. My sister drooled on my blanket. Who farted?" Okay, all of these things you hear from the back. And I suppose this scenario, which some of you are like, "Oh yeah, that's way too real, Dave." This aptly describes our text today because the Israelites are beginning a road trip. And not 30 minutes into their road trip, they start to complain. They're on this trip to the promised land and they whine, "Hey God, we aren't happy about," and then just fill in the blank because there's just a million things. "We're not happy." And furthermore, they say, "And God, this is your fault. We blame you because we're not happy." And of course, God isn't pleased with their complaining. In fact, the text says they kindled the anger of the Lord. Now, I don't think it takes a scholar to realize that's bad. That is not something you want to do, is to kindle the anger of the Lord. Today's text dives into this issue of complaining. And the very first verse in our text sets the tone. It says, "And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes." Don't you just hear their minivan trip? Don't you just hear them whining and complaining? Today, if there's one idea that I want you to take from this text, one thing to remember as you go home for lunch, it's this: be thankful for what God has given you today. Be thankful for what God has given you today. Don't complain. Don't grumble. Rather, be thankful. All right, so we're in this book, series on the book of Numbers. It's about a journey. And the Israelites have been living in this book. They live in the wilderness for 40 years. It's a 40-year-long journey to the promised land. And this book is about being in the wilderness. It's being in this nowhere place. That's the wilderness, the Bible's version. The wilderness is in the Bible is God's nowhere place. It's the people's, we're just waiting. It's 40 years on a journey. And last week in chapter 9 and 10, the day of departure is at hand. It's arrived. They packed up camp at Mount Sinai and they're heading off on a journey. And it was the conclusion last week, was the conclusion to these first 10 chapters of really a preparation for a journey. Now in chapter 11, the spiritual temperature of the book of Numbers is going to take a downward turn. And everyone starts complaining. It's in decline. You just feel this as we're going through the text. And it really raises the question today. The people complained in the hearing of the Lord. Are you a complainer? I mean, just stop and process that for just a moment. Are you a complainer? I mean, no one wants to raise their hand and go, "Yeah, I'm a complainer. You want to point to the person next to you maybe and say, yeah, there's your complainer today. But no one wants to say, yeah, I'm a complainer. It's like you're watching the game with your in-laws, and there's this one guy who complains about everything that happens. Bad refs, bad coaching, lazy defense, inept offense, which happens to be led by the coach's son, who's hypothetically named Brian. Okay, so you might complain, and you complain. And yet here we have a whole nation of people who are complainers against God. Be thankful for what God has given you today. Don't complain. All right, so we're going to dive into the text today. And really, this text starts with a 3-verse introduction. And then we're going to get into 6 ways that you might know if you're a complainer. So before we get to the 6 ways, let's just look at this 3-verse introduction in chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. And the people complained. If you're in your scripture journal, we're on page 68. Chapter 11, verse 1. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of the place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. These 3 verses really just function as an introduction for us today. They give us a general feel or pattern for what's going to come in these 2 chapters that we're looking at, chapters 11 and 12 today. Now, I want to remind you of where we are in the book of Numbers. Adrian Reynolds, the commentator, put together this chart here that I want to throw up on the screen because it gives you really an idea of where. I just copied this literally right out of his commentary, so we'll give Adrian credit for this. But you get an idea of the spiritual state of the people. We divide book of Numbers into 2 sections. Chapter 1 to 25 is really about the first generation. There's a census that takes place. Chapter 26, 40 years later, a second generation comes up, and we have then a new generation. Now, in these first 10 chapters, it's really the spiritual state of the people has been pretty level. It's been God saying, this is to get you ready for the journey, and the people basically say, we'll obey. But in chapter 11, we see a turn. The journey sets, and the spiritual temperature of the people starts to decline seriously till we get to the very low point. So it's exciting for you is over the next 2 months, we're going to just be in free fall decline together, okay? Woohoo, I really want to go to the gathering on a Sunday every time. But I think we're going to find encouragement here, even in the spiritual decline of the people. So here we are. In verses 1 to 3, this complaint that the people have is very general. We don't know what it's about specifically. It just says the people complain. And I think what Moses is doing as he's writing this is he says, let me give you an example let me just give you a general feeling of the complaining that's happening. So the pattern is the people complain, the anger of the Lord he doesn't appreciate that, and then Moses prays and intercedes for the people. So that's a general pattern of how this works. And so now, we're going to look at this pattern, and in verse 4, we're going to start to see ways that you might realize if you're a complainer. Because no one, like I said, no one wants to admit that they're a complainer. But we're going to look at 6 ways that you might be tempted to complain. 6 reasons you might complain or ways. You might be a complainer if. This is, Jeff Foxworthy. You might be a redneck if. You might be a complainer if you do one of these 6 things. So let's look. The first one is this. You might be a complainer if you're weeping over the past. Verses 4 to 9. Look at verse 4. Now the rabble, which is a great word to describe the complainers, right? Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again. There's our word. They're weeping. And they said, Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers and melons and leeks, the onions. Oh, the garlic. Oh, but now our strength is dried up. There's nothing at all but this manna to look at. Manna, manna, manna. Okay, you need some context to understand what they're talking about. Earlier in the book of Exodus, we saw that the people came across, this place when they're in the wilderness, and they don't have anything to eat, and they're hungry, and they start this same thing. They say, oh, remember Egypt, how great? We had 3 squares a day there. We had all the food we could eat in Egypt. It was great. And so God, in his mercy, provides them with this bread that miraculously appears on the ground, and it's enough to feed them. And it's called manna. It literally means, what is it? They didn't know what it was, manna, but it was this bread, and it gave them food to eat. And so they had said, Egypt was so great, but now God has provided for them. Now it says they wept again. They're whining because now this manna is not so great anymore. I mean, it's kind of boring. Manna, all we get is manna. Our taste buds are going to die of boredom, sheer boredom. This is terrible. Remember Egypt? That was so great. And then they list the exotic, flavorful, exciting foods that they got. The text says they wept again because they're romanticizing the past. They're remembering all these great things of the past. They might be forgetting something, though. Yeah, they were in slavery in Egypt. Do you want to know how in Exodus chapter 1, how the text describes their situation that now they're saying was so awesome? Here, I'll just read it to you. The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard work in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. The Egyptians used them ruthlessly. Later it says, Pharaoh gave this order, every boy that is born you should throw into the Nile. I mean, that's great. That's awesome. I mean, wow, how awesome the past was, huh? They conveniently forgot all that stuff. And they just remembered how tasty their taste buds were. It's just romanticizing the past. We do this too, don't we? I mean, there are times where it's an okay thing. Like, when I think about my dad, who's been dead now 10 years, I know my dad wasn't perfect, and he made a lot of mistakes, and there was stuff. But I just remember the good things, mostly. I mean, I know that there was stuff that wasn't great, but I just remember a lot of the good things. I think there's a time where remembering the good things in the past, there's a place for that. But most of the time, when we're remembering the past, we're not remembering it correctly. We've romanticized it. And so we get to this thing where we say, like, oh, the past was so much better. Here's what I hear people do sometimes. Oh, the church of my childhood was so great, Dave. You should be more like the pastor of my childhood. Like, oh, yeah, really? Okay. Have you really thought about how great that was? Or, how about this? My former job was so much better than my current job. Or my former house, that place, that town we used to live in, it was awesome. Remember when our kids were little? Remember that? When we had no problems. Yeah, I guarantee that when your kids were little, you were thinking, how long till this phase of life is over? But we romanticize it, don't we? We say, we tell people with little kids, like, just you wait. You'll blink and they'll be adults. And then they're thinking, yeah, and I can't wait. I'm blinking. Has it happened yet? I mean, we just romanticize the past and we make it so great, and that leads us to complaining about the present. You see, if you weep over the past, you might be a complainer. There's a second question here in the text. The story continues here. The second way you might know if you're a complainer is if you're displeased over a burden. If you express displeasure regularly over some burden in life that you're carrying, you might be a complainer. Look at verse 10. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give their fathers. Verse 13. Where am I to get meat to give all this people? For they weep before me and they say, give us meat that we can eat. I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden's too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I might not see my wretchedness. Okay, calm down, drama queen Moses. I mean, do you hear a little complaining? Like, wow, God, this is just too much for me. Moses gets sucked into the complaining. He's complaining about them complaining, and he becomes a complainer. God, this burden's too much, he says. I don't like this role you gave me. Just kill me. I can't take it anymore. Have you ever complained to God about the burden of life that you're in, the place where you're in, the burden that you feel? You ever complained about that? I think we all have, haven't we? God, why do I feel this weight now? It's too much for me. There was a time when we had all 6 kids at home. My dad was near death. My newborn son was sick. We wondered if he was going to make it. The church was in a really difficult place. I was dealing with my own depression. Clarissa's parents were going through some really tough things. And I remember thinking, God, I know that you promised to always be with me. I know I'm not alone. I know you can handle anything that you put in front of me, but this just feels like too much. I suppose it was my spiritual way of complaining. I know I shouldn't complain, so I'll just sort of spiritualize it. God was very kind to us. That's the thing. He surrounded our family with friends and our church elders who helped carry the burden. And he let me know that the burden wasn't mine alone to carry. It wasn't Clarissa's alone to carry. And so God had a solution for us, and he has a solution for Moses. Look at the text. Look at verse 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, gather for me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and officers over them, and bring them to the tent of meeting, that's the tabernacle, and let them take their stand there with you. And I will come down and talk with you there, and I will take some of the Spirit that is on you, and I will put it on them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you may not bear it yourself alone. God says to Moses, this isn't your burden alone to bear. He actually listens to Moses. He says, gather these 70 elders. I'm going to take some of the blessing, the Spirit, the empowerment that I've put on you. I'm going to give it to them so that they can carry the burden with you. I mean, I think this is all. I mean, this just shows God's heart, right? Because, if this is me, I'm like, Moses, just shut your trap. Just knock it off. He doesn't say that. He doesn't go, Moses, you have no idea what it's like to bear a burden. He doesn't say that. He doesn't go, have you seen all these other people and the burden they carry? He doesn't do that. He just says, Moses, the burden isn't yours alone. You see, you might be a complainer if you're displeased with God over the burden you bear. And part of that is you might not recognize that God has given you someone to share the burden with you. You might be a complainer if you're displeased with the burden you bear. That takes us to our third question in the text, really. You might be a complainer if you doubt God's ability. Look at verse 18. Here, the account continues. And God says to Moses, he says, say to the people, consecrate yourself, for tomorrow you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat. You shall eat. You shall not, you shall not eat just 1 day, or 2 days, or 5 days, or 10 days, or 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we come out of Egypt? Okay, I think every parent can relate to this, right? Like, it just cracks me up when I read it. You want meat? I'll give you meat. A whole month worth of meat. Till it's coming out, you're not like the visual image of meat coming out someone's nose is funny. Okay, that's just funny. I don't care who you are. That's hilarious. And here we go. God, I think every parent can relate to this at some point. And what's really interesting here is Moses' response. Because I would think he would sort of chuckle with the Lord. But his response is to doubt that God can do this. Again, look at the text. Look at verse 21. But Moses said, the people among whom I am the people among who I am number 600,000 on foot, and you said, I will give them meat that they may eat a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them? And would that be enough for them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them and be enough for them? Moses is saying, where are you going to get meat for a month for 600,000 men, plus all their families and wives, their children, their extended... I mean, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of meat. Moses is sort of, doing the math in his head, and he's like, okay, we got 3 meals a day, 600, so he's calculating the sheep per person ratio, or the fish per person ratio, and he's calculating that in his head, okay, so this means we need this many sheep, and carry the one, and I need, whatever, and he comes out, and we need 7 trillion sheep. I don't know, I didn't actually do the math, but it's a lot. It's like, I've done the math, and I don't know where you're going to get all these sheep, God, where you're going to get all this fish for a whole month till it's coming out their nose. Look at God's answer in verse 23. And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's hand shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. You see, Moses just doubts. Can God really do this? Does he really have the ability to provide what he said he would provide? It's not a stretch for you and I to put ourselves in Moses' shoes here, is it? It's not a stretch for us to go, will God really? Really provide? I mean, you don't have a family of 600,000, but you might have a family of 2 or 4, I don't know, 6, 8, 10, whatever you have. And you think, God, I know what it's like to look at my checking account at the end of the month and total up all my bills and wonder, how is there going to be enough dollars to cover all the bills? Like, how's that going to work? It's not a stretch for us to put ourselves in Moses' shoes at all. And God says this. Let's see. Let's just see. Is my hand too short? Do I lack the power to do what I promised to take care of you? Jesus said it this way. God says he takes care of the birds. Like the birds, the lilies of the field, they clothe themselves. Like God cares enough about that. You think he doesn't care about you and your daily needs? You might be a complainer if you're doubting God's ability. And doubt turns into complaint. There's a fourth thing then in the text. You might be a complainer if you're jealous for the wrong leader. This takes an interesting turn. Like, I didn't really expect this when I was looking through the text. And so look at what happens. There's this doubting that takes place. There's this jealousy then that Joshua does. So, all right, summary. Moses lines up the 70 leaders around the tabernacle. And remember, he had told him, I'm going to share some of the burden of ministry with them. I'm going to take some of my spirit and put it on them. And so the cloud descends, and the Spirit of the Lord is given to these guys, and they start prophesying. It's a sign of being blessed by God, sharing the burden. So they're all prophesying. But we find out in the story of the text that two of these guys couldn't make the meeting. They weren't there. Their names were Eldad and Medad. Again, baby names that need to make a comeback, right? Eldad and Medad couldn't be at the meeting. There's two of the 70 leaders, and they had a dentist appointment or something. I don't know. They couldn't make it. And so all of a sudden, they weren't at the Moses-sanctioned event. They just weren't there. And then all of a sudden, they were going to start prophesying too. And Joshua does not like this at all. He's not happy. Joshua is Moses' right-hand man. He's his number 2. And he says, they're out of line. Joshua is about Moses. And he doesn't like that they're prophesying without having placed themselves at the official event. Look at verse 27. And a young man ran and told Moses, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. And Joshua's going, wait, but they weren't at the meeting. Like, they weren't this is not sanctioned. And so Joshua, the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, says, my Lord Moses, stop them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. You see, here's the thing. Joshua's loyalty to Moses, it's admirable, but ultimate loyalty should be to God. And when our loyalty is placed on the wrong leader in the wrong place, we start to complain about things that are outside that leader's control. I think that in our world, Christians in today's age get too pastor focused. We love our celebrity pastors, don't we? We just like them. We follow them on their podcasts, and we watch their video record. Whoa, and we get preachers that we really like. And they think that their pastor is the authorized voice of God, and they place their loyalty in a person. We pastors appreciate loyalty. There just isn't enough loyalty in the world. But we pastors are supposed to take your eyes off of us and put it on Jesus. That's what we're supposed to do. Because this isn't about Dave Brooks. This isn't about any particular pastor. This is all about Jesus. And we let it go to our heads, But it's not about, just like Moses, it's not about me. It's about God. And all of a sudden, if you find yourself, getting defensive of a pastor or a ministry or any leader, a politician, you start finding yourself defending him or her, let it go. Because your focus should be on God and him alone. So all of a sudden, we start to complain because we're jealous for the wrong leader. We should be jealous for the Almighty God. There's a fifth thing. You might be a complainer if you're ungrateful for God's good gifts. All right, so the meat comes. It's in the form of quail. Millions of birds migrate in. And in this region of the world, this is not unheard of. Huge flocks of quail. And they come in, and they migrate in, and they cover the ground 3 feet of quail. That's a lot of quail. Now the nostril thing kind of makes sense a little bit, right? In the camp. And so we get this picture. Look at verse 32. And the people rose all day and all night and all the next day, and they gathered this quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. That's a lot. Okay, they're gathering a lot. Even the least person had their bushel baskets out there, and they're gathering these claims, and they're lining them up and setting them out, and you get this sense here that there's just this hoarding going on. They're I know it's 3 feet, but what if someone else gets more than me? And they're just scrambling to get their quail in the basket first, And there's greed and selfishness everywhere they go. And I find that there's some really important things missing in the text. I mean, that verse 32, they're out for themselves, and they're spreading out their spoils all around the camp, and they're getting these bushel baskets filled with quail, and there's some words that are missing. There are two words that are missing from their lips. They sound like thank you. There's no thank you. There's just this frenzy to hoard quail. In fact, their faces are so full of meat, they can't even get the words out. Look at verse 33. And the meat was yet between their teeth. Before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the very people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Like, there's just this selfishness and ingratitude amongst them. They got quail coming out their teeth, and they can't even stop to get the words thank you out. I don't know, how do you feel as a parent? Let's say you saved to take your kids on a dream vacation, like it's Disneyland, or I don't know, some crazy, awesome, maybe you're a national parks person, whatever. You're like taking your kids on this trip, and all of a sudden, they just behave horribly towards you or their siblings on the trip. If that happens, it probably doesn't go well for your kids, right? Like, come on. Side note, the wrath of God here over ungratefulness, at first glance, this might seem petty, like, wow, that's a pretty big response to ungratefulness. But I think what, I would have say two things here. One, that just shows you and I don't understand the gravity of our sin. We just don't get it. We don't get that our sin is serious. And the wrath, we deserve a wrath. We just want God to sweep it under the rug because we just don't get the gravity of our sin. But our sin is weighty and serious. But the second thing I would tell you is this is the beauty of the gospel. The gospel, all the wrath that is due you gets poured out, not on you, but on Jesus and God himself. He takes all the wrath so you don't have to experience it. It's the beautiful message of the gospel that we see here in the book of Numbers, is that in our selfishness and in our ingratitude and in our complaining, all the wrath that's due us gets poured out on Jesus, on God himself. He takes it for us. It's really beautiful. I don't know. Have you ever stopped to say thank you for that? Have you ever just paused to say, God, all that you've given me, I mean, all you did for me was take the wrath of God that I deserved. But that's it. That's more. It's more than I ever deserved. But what's more, look at all the good gifts you've given me. Yeah, but we're like the Israelites, right? We're like too busy cramming our mouths with quail. It's between our teeth. We can't even get the words out. You might be a complainer if you're ungrateful for God's good gifts. All right, sixth thing. You might be a complainer if you're speaking against your leaders. Chapter 12, verses 1 to 10. I just want to read this and talk through it. So, first of all, it says, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. Okay, so Miriam is Moses' sister, and Aaron is Moses' brother. It's his siblings. Now they're turning on him. Because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he married a Cushite woman. This is probably his wife Zipporah. When he left Egypt and lived in the wilderness for 40 years, he met Zipporah, who's from Midian, or also called, that region's called Cush. This is probably his wife. So, like, we got racial stuff, just bigotry and hatred going on here. They just don't like it. And so they're like, okay. They said, has the Lord indeed only spoken through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. So their complaint here is simply, like, hey, the Bible describes Aaron as a prophet. He spoke. He describes Miriam as a prophetess. she had spoken the words of the Lord. And why is Moses getting all this attention? I don't even look at him. He's not so great. He did something bad. He's not so great. We're awesome too. What can't we just have some, I think we could do a better job than Moses at this. It keeps going. Suddenly, verse 3, now, the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. Moses is the most humble guy on the face of the earth. Okay, time out. You think, okay, wait, Moses is writing this. Yeah, can the most humble guy on the earth write this about himself? And I think here we have one of the many evidence that Moses is the primary author, but he's got a group of his followers who are working. This is parentheses, add a commentary here. As they're compiling the text of Moses, they insert, under the divine inspiration of the Spirit, hey, you should know Moses was really humble. Okay? Just so that's how that's working out. Suddenly, the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam. And they both came forward, and he said, hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And when the cloud removed from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And so here we see God's response saying, Moses is different. You should have been careful. You should have thought before you complained against him. And Miriam comes out with leprosy. Now, why not Aaron? Right? Why just Miriam? Well, I think the text is driving the point that Miriam is, like Aaron's along for the ride, and Miriam is driving this thing. So, Aaron sees this, and you gotta understand, leprosy is terrible. This is something in our world we have modern medicine to deal with, but they didn't. Leprosy was terrible. And so he is thinking she's gonna die. And so he intercedes to Moses. He says, Moses, we're an idiot. We were both idiots. Do something. Please help your sister. So Moses then intercedes with God. He says, God, please help her. And so God does heal Miriam. She spends a week outside the camp, and then he heals her, and she comes back in. And in doing so, God reaffirms Moses as his chosen leader. Now, I think if we pause for just 2 seconds, you and I can relate to Aaron and Miriam here. Why is that leader so special? I could do better. If I were in charge, I could do this better. Have you ever thought you could do your job better than your boss? Have you ever complained about your position at work? Have you ever worked subtly to undermine a supervisor? I don't know. If that's you, you're probably a complainer. Be thankful for what God has given you. Be thankful. All right. Let's wrap all this up. What do you do if you are sitting here right now and you're like, wow, I can relate to one of those 6 things or all of those 6 things? I'm a complainer. What do you do? And by the way, you're all complainers, because I am too. All right? So what do we do? Well, first of all, I just think 2 things. See grumbling and complaining for what it is. A failure to trust God. When you're complaining about something, you just need to have this mental shift that tells you, I'm actually telling God what he provided for me isn't good enough. I don't trust him. At the heart of it, you're saying God is not good when you're complaining. You're saying God has not given me what I need. God is not enough for me. And there's a mindset change here. You got to choose not to focus on what God has not given you, but you got to choose to focus on what he has given you and trust him. So you got to just see it for what it is. The second thing I would tell you is instead see the goodness of God. I mean, he's faithful. He doesn't give us what we want. He gives us what is good, what we need. If you're a complainer, you got to shift your focus and think about the ways that God has blessed you with goodness. All right, so I needed a closing illustration this week. I was really struggling. Just come up with a good story that, like, just put all this together. And so my daughter, Kaylin, my oldest daughter, she's in the marketing world, and she uses AI all the time for stuff. She goes, Dad, you should use ChatGPT, like, in some way in your sermon. Like, use that. I'm like, okay, maybe this is the moment. I'll put in the input and see what ChatGPT says. I was really excited about this. So I said, give me an illustration about being grateful for God's goodness. And ChatGPT responded with a painting. I was like, oh, not wrong kind of illustration. Okay, so thank you for the painting. That was very nice. It was mountains and whatever. So I said, okay, give me a sermon illustration about being thankful for God's goodness. And so it came up with this flowery language. Imagine a child opening a gift on Christmas and not saying thank you to her parents. And I'm like, no, I gotta come up with that. Come on, something better than that. So I said, okay, let's get more specific. Give me a sermon illustration from history about being thankful for God's good gifts. And so all of a sudden, it like researched every online sermon and came up with all the worst pastor illustrations possible, right? All the ones that we've all heard a million times. Like, it came up with Corrie ten Boom and Hudson Taylor and George Mueller and John Newton and all these sermon-y stories that I've heard a million times. And so I was like, that's no good. I'm like, make it funny. That's what I said. And so it gave me a funny joke about a monk complaining to God. You've heard it before. It wasn't that great. All right. Then I get ready to type the next one, and ChatGPT responds, you've used up all your inquiries, and we're going to take you to the dumber version of AI now for future inquiries. And so I was so frustrated. What good is this? All these AI things, it's not helpful to me at all. Come on. Someone else give me a free tool. They could at least make it worth my time. And then it's all garbage. I'll teach someone to give me something for free. And then God goes, Dave, I think your closing illustration is you. I mean, I'm complaining about the free gift that was given to me. Is this not us? Is this not who we are? I'm the Israelites. I'm complaining about the good thing that I've been given. And we just do this with God all the time. We complain. I became my closing illustration. How about you today? Are you the Israelites? Are you a complainer? Because in Jesus, God has given you every good thing. Can you see the goodness of God? Be thankful for what he's given you. Heavenly Father, we just pause and I don't know, in this moment as the worship team's coming up, I'm thinking about how ungrateful I am. And I just confess that to you, Lord. And we do together here, all of us. We know what ungrateful people we are. And we confess that to you. We lay it at your feet and thank you that we don't have to experience and kindle the wrath of God because Jesus took it for us. And for that, we see nothing but the goodness of God. Would you give us the courage to say no to complaining and to only see the goodness that you have given us. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.